I'm Kimberly and this is Inside Exec, and this week I'm flying solo so I can talk about anything I like and no one's going to argue with me. What I wanted to discuss with you today is a topic that we've touched on very briefly in the past, and it's about knowing when the right time to call it quits. We often celebrate starting new things, but we rarely talk about the wisdom of stopping something. In the past, probably, let's say 2 to 3 years, I've had the opportunity to take that wisdom on board and to decide that it was time to stop. And most recently, it happened over this past weekend when I'm recording it on a Tuesday. So it is about an activity that I have been doing for 10 plus years. It's a competitive activity and it's not continuously competitive. I have been involved in the administration side of it as well, and I stopped the administration side of it as a result of an incident that occurred. So that in terms of deciding when to call it quits, that was forced upon me. Not forced upon me in that I had to do it, but I made the decision at that point to not continue in that administrative role. And I made it for all the reasons that I'm going to talk about in terms of internal and external signals about whether it was worthwhile continuing in that vein. And also I will talk about that one where change was a situation made me think about changing and make the decision about changing, because I think if I look back on it, I had already had lots of time to think about whether I really wanted to continue in that administrative role or not. And most recently, it's been more on the practical side of it. And so it has come time for me to make a decision about continuing to compete and what I'm getting out of that competition. It's a good example, a good time for me to be talking about this particular activity. So how do you know when it's the right time to call a halt to your career, to a project, or to an activity? 3 very different things, obviously, but I think there are similarities in the decision-making process. So if we look first of all at the internal signals, so things like loss of passion or energy, it becomes an obligation rather than you motivated to do it. And I will keep going back to those examples that I talked about in the beginning. So this past weekend, I need some time to prepare for a competition. I left it until 2 days before I needed to be at the competition to do the preparation, and that was because I wasn't motivated. And I have, looking back on it now, I can see that I wasn't motivated and I didn't know how to motivate myself. There wasn't a way of me looking at this as an opportunity, as a chance to reconnect with people that I only see at competitions, all of those things. None of that was foremost in my mind. It was an obligation. I had said I would compete, and so I will compete. And so there was no passion to compete. There was no energy to compete. And if that was lacking, why are you doing it? Why waste your time, basically? The other thing to think about in terms of internal signals is shifts in personal values or priorities. So perhaps you've got health issues, family issues, different ambitions in terms of the activities or the career that you're following. And so you have to take note of those, and they become the decision-making factors. Feeling stagnant, so no more learning or challenge, and that's probably where I am at the moment, is that I guess it's a combination of the personal values and feeling stagnant, and certainly that loss of passion and energy this particular weekend. But if I look back to the previous example, which was 2 years ago, I felt that there was still challenge there, but there was no a way that I could present the challenges in a way that they would be taken on board, that they would be accepted or modified for the organisation I was with at the time. What I do have, though, is new ambitions in this arena. And yes, it will be hard, and I don't know how some of the things are going to happen, but they do stir a bit of passion and a bit of energy in me when I start to think about them. So it's both the internal signal that it's time to leave, but it's also a positive signal that there's something else to move on to. And that might not always be the case. At the time, 2 years ago, I didn't think it was the case. I thought, this is an end. This is, what am I going to do with all of the time that I've been giving to this activity? One of the things that you need to reflect on in terms of that is that, have you ever felt those kind of inner signals? Is that what you're feeling now? Is it something that you need to address and write down? So, I'm the great list builder, the great list doer. So for me, it was about, okay, where's my passion? Where's my energy? And doing a percentage rating. So if I think about this activity that I have to do, is my passion at 50% or below? And if it's below, I have to start thinking about really how am I going to turn that around? Do I want to turn that around? And if I don't, it's something that I take on board. That's a decision that I'm already making. So we look at some of the external signals. They're pretty much aligned to the internal ones as well. It's about diminishing returns on effort versus reward. And I guess this was the mainstay of my decision making. And to a lesser extent, it was a decision that I made a couple of weeks ago about an activity, about some workshops that I was running. And it was the case with the public speaking activities when I changed my focus away from them, because there's a lot of effort goes into anything that you do, whether it's a project or an individual career choice. That effort needs to have some sort of reward. You need to know that what you're putting in, you're going to get back in some fashion. And sometimes it's recognizing how you're getting it back. It's not always the way you expected to get it back. So if I look at the floral art, for example, a lot of effort goes into putting a design together, getting it ready, getting to the competition, choosing the flowers, all those sorts of things. And in an instant, probably less than 5 minutes, it is judged, and the reward is either you get a place or you don't. And when that doesn't happen and there's no feedback about it, you tend to reminisce and to reflect on the idea that perhaps that all of that effort is not worth the reward. That said, sometimes you go through all of that same effort, you do get the acknowledgement, you do get the reward, but it's not aligned, it's not in proportion to the effort that you've put in. So if I look at the years that I competed down in Sydney at the Easter show, for those of you who are familiar with that, the floral art side of things, it was 2 weeks, essentially usually between 35 and 40 designs that I would put together in that 2 weeks that were judged. And that's a lot of effort. There were years where I would drive back and forwards every second day, and so I was sleep deprived, I was under pressure, time pressure to get things ready for the time that the judging happened, pressures in terms of the drive down, because it's an hour and a half drive there and back, the Easter traffic over the Easter weekend, the show traffic within the show itself. For those of you who know it will understand what I'm saying. It's about, yes, some years I was successful, some years I was less successful, but when I look back on it, it was a good thing that there was 12 months between each show, because I would finish the show and I would think, oh, never again, I'm not going to do it again. It's just too much effort. And yes, I get the rewards, but it's the same every year. And so there's no challenge in it. And that was one of the internal signals that we looked at before. So in fact, this year, so 2025, was the first year in 20 years that I didn't compete at the Easter show. I did go down, I did have a look, and I did enjoy the show, but I didn't feel a great sense of loss for not competing in terms of the physical activity. I was sad about not seeing the people that I see only once a year, that only compete at the Easter show, the camaraderie that happens between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning when you're all trying to do the same thing and you're all under the same sorts of pressure. but I wasn't missing the actual activity, the floral art. I was missing the social side of it, the interaction side of it. And so that was something that I recognised this year, and I thought, well, I need to look for that, because that's what I gain out of that activity is the social interaction. Yes, there's design challenge, but I don't look for the reward in the design challenge as much anymore as I used to. Another thing that perhaps as we continue in our careers we need to start to think about is that our reward acknowledgement will change over that period of time. So the things that you looked for as acknowledgement and reward when you first started out in your career are nowhere near as important, I wouldn't think, as the things that are important to you now in your career. Quality slipping or results declining despite best efforts. So this one is probably more geared around project work. So if the quality of the output of your project team is slipping, or the results perhaps are not coming in the way you expected them to, despite everyone putting in their best effort, perhaps it is time to rethink the project, rethink the goals, rethink the process, and to make a decision one way or the other. There's the great adage that we hear all the time about you can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. If you want a different result, you've got to do something different. So that's thinking about whether, despite everything you do, if the result is not there in terms of the measurement that needs to happen, how can you change what you do? Or is it time to say, we're just not going to get there now, perhaps we need to put this on the back burner, we need to rethink it completely, have a completely different approach, or ditch it altogether and say it's just not going to work on this occasion. Support is fading. So stakeholders, audience or team are not engaged. And I think that probably comes into the one before as well, because if your stakeholders, your audience or your team are not engaged, you're not going to get the results that you want. The quality will slip because people are focused elsewhere. They're not giving it their full support because, once again, the internal signals are saying to them that the passion, the motivation has gone for this particular activity. There might also be external pressures that make you rethink your career or your project. And that's not in terms of personal pressures, because we always deal with those, but in terms of perhaps regulations change, something new is introduced into the workplace or the work arena. It might be that the product or service that you have relied on for all of these years is no longer of interest to the audience or the client group that you were looking at. And so that's an external pressure that needs you to rethink what you're offering. And there are hundreds of examples out there. Our guests have talked about where organisations got left behind because the external pressures changed and they didn't leap to the fore of looking at what they needed to change within their organisation. And the one that keeps coming to mind is Kodak and the digital camera and film camera. And yes, there's still film cameras out there, but everyone has a phone now that'll take a pretty good photo. In all of that, we still do need to be practical about when it's time to call it quits. So you need to be financially viable, and you need to have sustainability, and you need to have your health and well-being. And the one thing that I want to bring into this practical considerations side of things is about missing out on other opportunities because you're committed to this particular activity, even though you're having these thoughts about, is it time to stop? And that's the situation that I was in. I was missing out on opportunities that I had identified because I felt I needed the commitment to the organisation that I was with at the time. There were lots of ideas that I had brought to that organisation that I felt would benefit the organisation. Obviously, that's why I suggested them. They weren't prepared to take them on. I still knew that they were opportunities that were not being addressed by anybody else. and that if I put my mind to it, I could address those opportunities. And yes, there would be ups and downs in it, but I needed to acknowledge that I was missing out on providing and pursuing those opportunities because of this commitment to an organisation who didn't want to do things. And so that's a hard decision to make, I will say, because when you get to a certain point in your career, you feel like you are committed to an industry or to an organisation or to an activity, and you don't want to let that go because you're letting part of yourself go. And I very much felt that at the time, that if I did away with being part of that organisation and that commitment to that organisation, who was I going to be? And it's no different to all of the times we've talked about when you retire and you say, I used to be this. So I have struggled with that and finding out who and believing who I think I am now, because I gave away a commitment that was a long-term commitment. It was 10 plus years I had been with the organisation and had moved them from being a small organisation into something that was ready for the 21st century. You know, there was someone there who used to always acknowledge the work that I'd done over that time and would say, you dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century. But I did get them there, and they did know that they needed to do that. But there was a certain point where they weren't comfortable going any further. And I had to recognise that and know that it wasn't me, but it was the collective organisation that weren't ready for that next leap of faith in terms of moving forward or looking at markets that they hadn't looked at before. So, how do you make the decision? One of the things you can do is set markers. So, this is very much in my planned approach, is you can say, if this happens, I'll step back. I first started my career, when I first started working with Fulyana, we were both in the public service, and I made a very definite decision at that time that I would only stay in the public service for 10 years, because I felt that was enough time for me to learn what I could learn from the public sector. But also, any longer than that, to me, felt like you were becoming the quintessential public servant. You saw that as your career and not expose yourself to any of the other vagaries of the commercial world, shall we say, at that time. So we're talking 1970s, 1980s, and certainly things have changed somewhat in that period of time. But I did I did set that marker and say, when I get to 10 years, I'll move on from the public sector. And just as an aside, I knew that was the case, and so I started in my 10th year, as the 10th year progressed, I started to look around for other opportunities and found one and got a job, and they needed a decision. My 10 years with the public sector was up on a Monday, and they wanted a decision on the Friday before. So I was really in a dilemma of, do I stick with what I set myself, the goal I set myself? This is a good job. It's new opportunities. It's new learning. It's exciting. I'm passionate about it, and so I did move on. But that's about setting the marker in advance. You can always talk to mentors or peers outside for a different perspective. So people will see you in a different light than you see yourself in terms of your career or a project that you're working on. So it's always a good idea to have a sounding board of some description, someone who is independent, someone who you trust is going to tell you the things you need or don't need to hear or don't want to hear about your work or your project or the situation that you're in. So a mentor or a peer with an outside perspective is a good thing to do. You can have a trial, withdraw, so take a short break or a sabbatical. But what I hesitate about that, because I don't think that you dissociate yourself completely with the situation. I think at a short break, certainly you don't, because any evidence that we have over the years about holidays and recreational leave is that it takes you a week to unwind from a job, and then it takes you 2 or 3 days to start thinking about the job again when you're going back. So really a short break, anything less than 6 weeks is not going to give you a clear head to think about what you need to be doing. And I think the sabbatical's the same. I think that even a longer break, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, you still, unless you find something that ignites a passion and a desire within you to do something else, you won't make the decision. We're not good at making decisions when we're pretending that we're doing something else, shall we say. So we're having a holiday, I'm not going to think about work. How often have you heard that phrase? And yet we do think about work, and we do think about what we're going to do, how it can fix the situation, and particularly if this is worrying you, if this is a decision that you know you have to make, or you feel it is important to make at this point in your career, then you will continue to think about it. And being away from the workplace doesn't always help you. Sometimes it will. I acknowledge that for some people that's going to work, but for the bulk of us, we need to have clear thinking space. And that doesn't happen if you're focused on, I'm going to focus now on having a holiday. I'm having a holiday. I'm not thinking about work. And as soon as you say, I'm not thinking about work, a work thought will follow that. So I'm not as supportive of the trial withdrawal idea, but it might work for you. So that's why I have included in the discussion. We've had guests reasonably recently talk about neuroplasticity and talking about reframing the way we think about situations. So what we have to do is that stopping something, whether it's your career, a project, or some other activity, isn't failure. And that's probably the hardest hurdle to overcome, and that's the one I still struggle with in terms of what happened 2 years ago. I still see it as, what could I have done? What didn't I do right? How could I have brought that situation around? I thought it was going well until up to this point in time. What did I miss? It's all internalizing. And in fact, what it has been, when I look at it now for this discussion, is that it was a strategic new beginning, because it made me focus on the things that I had said I wanted to do for the organisation, or I wanted to do for this area of expertise that hadn't been done in the past. So I had to put my money where my mouth was, and that forced me to do it, because I don't think I would ever have got there. I would always have found a reason to stay in the comfort zone and not test my theories and not run the risk of being wrong. And being wrong is not a bad thing. And fortunately, I haven't been wrong. I've been probably middle of the road, but that just means I have to think of other ways to enthuse the audience that I'm looking for this activity. You need to celebrate what you've achieved up to this point. So whether it's your career, whether it's a project, whatever else it is, that you celebrate how far you've come, what you have done. One of the things these podcasts have done for both Fulyana and I is to remind us of how much we have achieved and how much we have learned along the way, good and bad lessons. But we needed to do the podcast, I think, in some ways, to remind ourselves of that. And that's been a great thing for us. Always, if you're leaving an organisation, you're leaving a career, you're leaving a project, leave well by passing on knowledge or resources or suggestions. These days, not so much as it was in the past do we have exit interviews where we get people to talk about what they liked about the organisation, what they would change from the organisation. We don't seem to have the process to deal with the answers, let alone ask the questions. But it is important for you, as a mark of your respect for where you have been working or what you've been working on and the people you've been working with, is that you pass on the knowledge, the unconscious competencies that you've developed over the years, and the resources. And that's particularly important in terms of a project that you might stop, because you don't know that in 5, 10, 15 years' time, there might be an opportunity for that project to be revisited. And so it is important for that new team to be able to look at what was done in the past with the resources they had in the past and see what they don't have to go over again, or what they can adjust from what has already been done. I guess the message that I want to get through to you is that the right time to stop isn't about weakness. It's about wisdom. It's about knowing yourself, knowing the project, knowing your career, knowing an organisation, and saying, now is the time. And being wise enough to recognise that it's you that has to make that decision, and it is best for you to make that decision. So what are you holding on to that might be ready to end? And what could open up if you let it go? And I think that's the most important thing. We heard a couple of guests ago, talk about what could go right with this situation. And I think that is a hugely important question that we should ask ourselves. I have formed a habit these days of when I'm up against something that just seems to be continually stacking wrong things on top of wrong things, and leaves me feeling, where am I going to go next, is that I ask that question. I say, what could go right? If all of these things happened, what could go right? So I leave you with that question. What are you holding on to that might be ready to end? And what could open up if you let it go? I'm Fulyana, and this is Inside Exec.